You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars. Follow me there to be the first to know about my upcoming plans. Hello everybody, you find me this week in Norfolk, where I've just departed the car park of the lovely Bird in Hand, a fine pub, one I highly recommend. I'm here courtesy of channel fan Jack, who's brought me a pair of his cars. They're both Italian, and they're both what you might now call cult classics, despite only being about 15 years old. And we're beginning with this, his daily driver, a Fiat Panda 100 horsepower. This is a car I've been apprehensive about trying for quite some time. On the one hand, it's exactly the sort of car that I really relish. And the reason I was happy to come to here is because although this particular road has a 50-mile-an-hour limit on it, this is the kind of car that should make 50 mile an hour rather enjoyable. However, I'm also aware of the fact that this is an extremely close relative of the Fiat 500 and Abarth 595, of which I'm famously not a fan. One of the reasons I've never been a fan of the 595 is that they aren't especially cheap cars, particularly for the top-end models, yet there's nothing really that different about them to make them feel like a more expensive car. In fact, I had a little chuckle to myself because one of the things I have criticised the 595 for is the fact that it still has a 5-speed manual gearbox when everybody else has moved to at least a 6. And what do I find here under my left hand? A 6-speed gearbox. Actually, quite a nice one. Before we get on to the nitty-gritty though, let's tell you a little bit about the Panda in general. This is the second generation car, was introduced in 2003. Though it's long been discontinued, the platform and engine used in this car are still in service today as the Abarth 595. Yep, that's right, the cars currently on sale are using a platform 20 years old and an engine that can trace its roots back to the 80s. Absolutely incredible. Unlike some of the spicier Abarths, this is a naturally aspirated version of the little 1.4 fire engine. And I think for a car like this, that's the sort of power plant you want. It's hopefully still going to deliver the performance you'd expect, but with much better response than the turbocharged unit and potentially a better soundtrack. Although, if I'm being fair to the 595s, the way they sound is actually one of the better things about them. We have in fact also just seen a camouflaged Lotus Emira go past. That's actually the first time in my life I've seen one in the flesh. It actually looked very nice at a quick glance, although I'm still looking forward to having some proper time to sit down with one. The Panda was purchased by Jack as a daily for him and his wife. His other car is not actually dramatically more expensive than this, but a recent experience kind of put him off risking it too much, so he now reserves it for high days, holidays, and the odd YouTuber. Unlike some of the more militant Abarth fans, he's also perfectly aware of what this car is. It is cheap, economical, fun transport, nothing more. It's essentially a van with a few more seats in it, and that's exactly how he treats it. That's not to say he doesn't look after it, quite the contrary. He loves all of his cars equally, but this one, by its very nature, will tolerate a bit of aggressive driving in a way that a lot of other cars won't. When new, these cost only about £10,000. The big change over the regular Panda, of course, was the engine. However, it also got some bespoke bumpers, some different wheels, and if, like this car, you specified the brilliantly named Pandemonium pack, you also got some extra visual tweaks like the little stripe on the side, the white wing mirrors, different colour brake calipers, and a few other things, I think. Production on the 100 horsepower started in 2006, but ended in 2010, citing emissions concerns. These days, prices are still strong, and a quick glance at the classifieds would say that you could easily pay about £3,000 to get your hands on a reasonable example. As you might expect, for a cheap city car, luxury is not the order of the day. Everything in here is scratchy plastic, nasty cheap materials, and that's fine, because it was a cheap car, so feeling like a cheap car is not a flaw. The exterior styling, I have to say, I'm not a big fan of. Again, that's an area the Abarth scores highly. It's a much easier car on the eye. It has some really weird baby minivan proportions, and if you told me this was actually a K car, I'd nearly believe you, because it's got that kind of vibe about it. This particular example is almost standard. The sole modification has been the fitment of some Coney dampers in place of the regular ones. The springs are the original items, but the dampers apparently don't last all that long. They're also not that good, and the ride of the regular car isn't stellar. This, as it happens, is probably a little bit better than I expected, but any car with a wheelbase as short as this, which is trying to be a little bit sporty, is doomed, to be honest with you. And the back roads of Norfolk are hardly famed for their glassy surfaces. Rampant it is not, but enjoyable it actually is. That 100 horsepower has to drag about 900 kilos plus however many people you dare fit in this car down the road, and so performance is adequate, but ideal for the new or inexperienced driver, or simply an experienced driver that just wants to have an awful lot of fun without fearing too much for their license. Jack also has a modified Audi, and that, he says, is pretty much the opposite to this, because you put absolutely zero effort in, yet the speeds it will pick up are slightly scary. This you can thrash the life out of and find you're still some way shy of the speed limit. Cheap though it may be, the interior is certainly functional. A few bits are starting to wear, the steering wheel is beginning to disintegrate, the dash is basic but does its job, and I'm told there's actually quite a bit of room in here. One of the reasons that Jack got this is because, as a younger man, his dad had one from new, and he used to take his sons out to rugby where 3 of them actually played, so you can get a few big lads and a load of rugby kit in one of these without too much of a problem. The boot doesn't look overly generous, but because it's quite a tall car, if you're willing to stack things, you can actually get quite a bit in here. Its minuscule proportions also mean that you will be able to park this pretty much anywhere you can think of. And because the Panda platform as a whole is relatively common, parts for these are really cheap. You need to be careful about anything that's 100 HP specific, but beyond that, it's actually pretty easy to get more or less anything you might need. Service costs are also quite low, and fuel economy is pretty good too. I'm told whether you're Miss Daisy's chauffeur or you're Nigel Mansell, you'll still get over 40 to the gallon from this. And that's important because this is the kind of car that's likely to be bought by someone as their only car, perhaps even their first car, or maybe first sporty car. If you're a parent currently watching this, wondering if it might be a suitable car for your child, I'd say yes. The seating position is quite high, which makes visibility very good. The A-pillars are on the thick side, but they're placed so closely to you that it's really not a problem. The window is then low relative to you, so curbing the car should hopefully be reasonably difficult. The disadvantage of the high seating position is that if you are exceptionally tall, you may actually still struggle for room in here. However, a little bit of seat adjustment may well sort that. There isn't much really in the way of frills, but you do have air conditioning. The CD player here has an aux cable sticking out of it, which is very handy. If I had one of these, I think you just simply plug that into your phone, and that's going to give you all of your modern functionality. The gearbox, I have to say, is a real highlight, not just because of the unexpected 6th ratio, but it's also very nice to use. It's quite light, but the engine you can sort of heel and toe with needs a little bit more of a stab than you might expect. The car even has a sport mode. I've got to say, I'm not particularly fond of it, because what it does is turns the throttle into a switch. Here, it's only the gentlest of throttle inputs, and it does, I move my foot like that much. Here's the same movement with the throttle in normal. That's disappointing. It does, I'm told, also weighten up the steering, so I'm going to leave it in sport mode briefly and see if that does improve the overall experience. Not that I'm actually disliking it at the moment either. The steering is another of the items I never really liked on the 595. I don't think it helps that many of them have big, soft, chunky wheels that tend to ruin steering feel wherever they are fitted. And the 595 also has this weird thing where it simply does not want to turn very quick off dead center. The car's very happy to keep going in a straight line. This feels far more natural and linear in its responses. The red line here is at 6,500, however in truth you get to about 5.5 and the engine starts to tail off, so you'll find yourself changing just after 5. And now we're back in national speed limit, let's put that little engine through its paces. The gearing is so short that it was only as I was going into 5th that I actually reached 60 mile an hour. I wasn't absolutely pinning it in every single gear, but that does give you a rough idea of what this car's set up for. Typically before a review, I will do So the car just slid quite a bit there, more than I think I've had many cars on a review slide. It was a corner, in the damp, in the cold, in the shade, wasn't exactly unexpected. It turns out it wasn't just that corner being particularly bad either. I pushed on in a few other bends and the car did exactly the same thing each time. It washes wide in a fairly safe and predictable manner. So provided little Johnny hasn't confused himself with chem block, the car will give him a fairly safe piece of feedback that should help curb their speed without making too much of a mess of things. The rear end at no point has wanted to let go, and it's when that happens things really do start to go a little bit Pete-tong. The turning circle is also not stellar, which does take slightly from the car's city credentials. I have to say, I think it's actually the gearbox that is a real highlight of this car. Those ratios are so short. I'm driving through 20 and 30 limits and I'm still working all the way through the box to try and keep the engine spinning, and it's an absolute joy. Also very good if little Johnny is a boy racer, because he can go absolutely hell for leather and still won't actually be going that fast, but his mates probably won't know. Allow me to demonstrate. So I'm now in 3rd, I'm doing 30 mile an hour in a 60 limit, change down into 2nd, listen to that power, and then that that's what sport mode does. I don't like that kind of sport mode in these cars. So back in proper normal mode with decent linear pedal, that's 40 into 3rd, another few thousand revs, that's 50, that's into 4th, now at 4,000 RPM, 55, 57, 58, and that's about 60, about 4,500 revs going into 5th. Now we're into the 40 limit again, back down, change. The pedals are a little bit further apart than you'd ideally want for heel and toe, but that in a car like this really isn't an issue. If anything, you do want the more generous spacing because you want to be able to jump in this in work boots and still be able to drive okay. And you could. Competition in this marketplace is pretty stiff. The VW Lupo that I drove recently is really a class above, certainly feels it anyway, is a little bit pokier, but is also now more expensive to buy as well. The Renault Sport Twingo 133 has a bit more go in it, also has some trick sliding seats in the back, which is very nice, and the Twingo is actually based on the even older Clio. However, it feels broadly the same as this inside. Brake feel and stopping power seem both pretty decent. If anything, I think it's these tyres that are probably going to limit you. I generally have a policy of not watching or reading any reviews of cars I'm going to drive. However, with the 100 horsepower, I actually had seen a few before I even knew I was going to be driving this. I recall very well that James May actually quite likes this car, but I also remember that my friend Jack from number 27 doesn't like them at all. So I genuinely wasn't really sure what to expect from this. But I actually think I quite like it. I'm sure a few people will use that as a way to justify me being wrong on the Abarth 595, it being such a close relative and all that. However, there are just a few things that go to make the Panda a much more enjoyable experience. I prefer the naturally aspirated engine over the admittedly more capable turbo lump in the 595. The gearbox is a joy, the extra ratio very much appreciated. The Abarth is certainly the much better looking car and has an amazing aftermarket to support it. But I feel like the Panda's just a little bit unpretentious. Very few people out there would ever recognise it as being something a little bit different. Unless you knew your cars, you wouldn't think of this as anything beyond, well, a Panda. So there we have it, the Fiat Panda 100HP. Actually, quite an enjoyable car. I considered putting it in my Cool Cars for Young People playlist, and I may still do. But in truth, it's a car that in some ways is desperately uncool, but equally quite fun, and something I don't think you have to be young to appreciate. That's all from me for now. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.